Introduction to the History of Egypt by Gaston Maspero. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, by Gaston Maspero, Honorable Doctor of Civil Laws and Fellow of Queen's College, Oxford. Member of the Institute and Professor at the College of France. Edited by A. H. Sayce, Professor of Assyriology, Oxford. Translated by M. L. McClure, Member of the Committee of the Egypt Exploration Fund. Editor's Preface. Professor Maspero does not need to be introduced to us. His name is well known in England and America as that of one of the chief masters of Egyptian science, as well as of ancient Oriental history and archaeology. Alike as a philologist, a historian, and an archaeologist, he occupies a foremost place in the annals of modern knowledge and research. He possesses that quick apprehension and fertility of resource without which the decipherment of ancient texts is impossible, and he also possesses a sympathy with the past and a power of realizing it which are indispensable if we would picture it aright. His intimate acquaintance with Egypt and its literature, and the opportunities of discovery afforded him by his position for several years as director of the Boulak Museum, give him an unique claim to speak with authority on the history of the valley of the Nile. In the present work he has been prodigal of his abundant stores of learning and knowledge, and it may therefore be regarded as the most complete account of ancient Egypt that has ever yet been published. In the case of Babylonia and Assyria he no longer, it is true, speaks at first hand. But he has thoroughly studied the latest and best authorities on the subject, and has weighted their statements with the judgment which comes from an exhaustive acquaintance with a similar department of knowledge. Naturally, in progressive studies like those of Egyptology and Assyriology, a good many theories and conclusions must be tentative and provisional only. Discovery crowds so quickly on discovery that the truth of today is often apt to be modified or amplified by the truth of tomorrow. A single fresh fact may throw a wholly new and unexpected light upon the results we have already gained, and cause them to assume a somewhat changed aspect. But this is what must happen in all sciences in which there is a healthy growth, and archaeological science is no exception to the rule. The spelling of ancient Egyptian proper names adopted by Professor Maspero will perhaps seem strange to many. But it must be remembered that all our attempts to represent the pronunciation of ancient Egyptian words can be approximate only. We can never ascertain with certainty how they were actually sounded. All that can be done is to determine what pronunciation was assigned to them in the Greek period, and to work backwards from this, so far as it is possible, to more remote ages. This is what Professor Maspero has done, and it must be no slight satisfaction to him to find that on the whole his system of transliteration is confirmed by the cuneiform tablets of Tel el Amarna. The difficulties attaching to the spelling of Assyrian names are different from those which beset our attempts to reproduce, even approximately, the names of ancient Egypt. The cuneiform system of writing was syllabic, each character denoting a syllable, so that we know what were the vowels in a proper name as well as the consonants. Moreover, the pronunciation of the consonants resembled that of the Hebrew consonants, the transliteration of which has long since become conventional. When, therefore, an Assyrian or Babylonian name is written phonetically, its correct transliteration is not often a matter of question. But unfortunately, the names are not always written phonetically. The cuneiform script was an inheritance from the non-Semitic predecessors of the Semites in Babylonia, and in this script the characters represented words as well as sounds. Not unfrequently the Semitic Assyrians continued to write a name in the old Sumerian way, instead of spelling it phonetically, the result being that we do not know how it was pronounced in their own language. The name of the Chaldean Noab, for instance, is written with two characters which ideographically signify the sun, or day of life, and of the first of which the Sumerian values were Ut, Babar, Kis, Tarn, and Par, while the second had the value of Z. Were it not that the Chaldean historian Berassos writes the name Xisuthros, we should have no clue to its Semitic pronunciation. Professor Maspero's learning and indefatigable industry are well known to me, but I confess I was not prepared for the exhaustive acquaintance he shows with Assyriological literature. Nothing seems to have escaped his notice. Papers and books just published, and half forgotten articles in obscure periodicals which appeared years ago, have all alike been used and quoted by him. Naturally, however, there are some points on which I should be inclined to differ from the conclusions he draws, or to which he has been led by other Assyriologists. Without being an Assyriologist himself, it was impossible for him to be acquainted with that portion of the evidence on certain disputed questions which is only to be found in still unpublished or untranslated inscriptions. There are two points which it seem to me of sufficient importance to justify my expression of dissent from his views. These are the geographical situation of the land of Magan, and the historical character of the annals of Sargon of Akkad. The evidence about Magan is very clear. Magan is usually associated with the country of Melukhkha, the Salt Desert, and in every text in which its geographical position is indicated, it is placed in the immediate vicinity of Egypt. Thus Assur-bani-pal, after stating that he had gone to the lands of Magan and Melukhkha, goes on to say that he directed his road to Egypt and Cush, and then describes the first of his Egyptian campaigns. Similar testimony is borne by Esarhaddon. The latter king tells us that after quitting Egypt he directed his road to the land of Melukhkha, a desert region in which there were no rivers, and which extended to the city of Rapik, the modern Rapia, at the edge of the Wadi of Egypt, the present Wadi el Arish. After this he received camels from the king of the Arabs, and made his way to the land and city of Magan. The Tel el Amarna tablets enable us to carry the record back to the 15th century B.C. In certain of the tablets, now as Berlin, Winkler and Abel, 42 and 45, the Phoenician governor of the pharaoh asks that help should be sent him from Melukhkha and Egypt. The king should hear the words of his servant, and send 10 men of the country of Melukhkha, and 20 men of the country of Egypt, to defend the city of Gebel for the king. And again, I have sent to Pharaoh, literally the great house, a garrison of men from the country of Melukhkha, and the king has just dispatched a garrison from the country of Melukhkha. At a still earlier date we have indications that Melukhkha and Magan denoted the same region of the world. In an old Babylonian geographical list which belongs to the early days of Chaldean history, Magan is described as the country of bronze, and Melukhkha as the country of the Samdu, or Malachite. It was this list which originally led Opert, Lenormant, and myself independently to the conviction that Magan was to be looked for in the Sinaitic peninsula. Magan included, however, the Midian of Scripture, and the city of Magan, called Makan in Semitic Assyrian, is probably the Machna of classical geography, now represented by the ruins of Mukna. As I have always maintained the historical character of the annals of Sargon of Akkad, long before recent discoveries led Professor Hilprecht and others to adopt the same view, it is as well to state why I consider them worthy of credit. In themselves the annals contain nothing improbable. Indeed, what might seem the most unlikely portion of them, that which describes the extension of Sargon's empire to the shores of the Mediterranean, has been confirmed by the progress of research. Amisatana, a king of the first dynasty of Babylon, about 2200 B.C., calls himself king of the country of the Amorites, and the Tel el Amarna tablets have revealed to us how deep and long-lasting Babylonian influence must have been throughout Western Asia. Moreover, the vase described by Professor Maspero in the present work proves that the expedition of Naram Sin against Magan was an historical reality, and such an expedition was only possible if the land of the Amorites, the Syria and Palestine of later days, had been secured in the rear. But what chiefly led me to the belief that the annals are a document contemporaneous with the events narrated in them are two facts which do not seem to have been sufficiently considered. On the one side, while the annals of Sargon are given in full, those of his son Naram Sin break off abruptly in the early part of his reign. I see no explanation of this, except that they were composed while Naram Sin was still on the throne. On the other side, the campaigns of the two monarchs are coupled with the astrological phenomenon on which the success of the campaigns was supposed to depend. We know that the Babylonians were given to the practice and study of astrology from the earliest days of their history. We know also that even in the time of the later Assyrian monarchy it was still customary for the general in the field to be accompanied by the Asipu, or prophet, the Ashap of Daniel 2:10, on whose interpretation of the signs of heaven the movements of the army are dependent; and in the infancy of Chaldean history we should accordingly expect to find the astrological sign recorded along with the event with which it was bound up. At a subsequent period the sign and the event were separated from one another in literature, and had the Annals of Sargon been a later compilation, in their case also the separation would assuredly have been made. That on the contrary the Annals have the form which they could have assumed and ought to have assumed only at the beginning of contemporaneous Babylonian history, is to me a strong testimony in favour of their genuineness. It may be added that Babylonian sea cylinders have been found in Cyprus, one of which is of the age of Sargon of Akkad, its style and workmanship being the same as that of the cylinder figured in Volume 3, page 96, while the other, though of later date, belonged to a person who describes himself as the servant of the deified Naram Sin. Such cylinders may, of course, have been brought to the island in later times, but when we remember that a characteristic object of prehistoric Cypriot art is an imitation of the seal cylinder of Chaldea, their discovery cannot be wholly an accident. Professor Maspero has brought his facts up to so recent a date that there is very little to add to what he has written. Since his manuscript was in type, however, a few additions have been made to our Assyriological knowledge. A fresh examination of the Babylonian dynastic tablet has led Professor Delitzsch to make some alterations in the published account of what Professor Maspero calls the Ninth Dynasty. According to Professor Delitzsch, the number of kings composing the dynasty is stated on the tablet to be 21, and not 31 as was formerly read, and the number of lost lines exactly corresponds with this figure. The first of the kings reigned 36 years, and he had a predecessor belonging to the previous dynasty, whose name has been lost. There would consequently have been 2 Elamite usurpers instead of 1. I would further draw attention to an interesting text, published by Mr. Strong in the Babylonian and Oriental Record, which I believe to contain the name of a king, who belonged to the legendary dynasties of Chaldea. This is Samas Natsir, who is coupled with Sargon of Akkad and other early monarchs in one of the lists. The legend, if I interpret it rightly, states that Elam shall be altogether given to Samas Natsir, and the same prince is further described as building Nippur and Dur-ilu, as king of Babylon, and as conqueror both of a certain Baldaka and of Kumbasatir, the king of the cedar forest. It will be remembered that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Kumbaba is also stated to have been the lord of the cedar forest. But of new discoveries and facts there is a constant supply, and it is impossible for the historian to keep pace with them. Even while the sheets of his work are passing through the press, the excavator, the explorer, and the decipherer are adding to our previous stores of knowledge. In Egypt, Mr. de Morgan's unwearied energy has raised, as it were, out of the ground, at Kom Ombo, a vast and splendidly preserved temple of whose existence we had hardly dreamed. He has discovered 12th dynasty jewellery at Dashur of the most exquisite workmanship, and at Muir and Assuit has found in tombs of the 6th dynasty painted models of the trades and professions of the day, as well as fighting battalions of soldiers, which for freshness and lifelike reality contrast favourably with the models which come from India to-day. In Babylonia, the American expedition, under Mr. Haynes, has at Niffer unearthed monuments of older date than those of Sargon of Akkad. Nor must I forget to mention the lotiform column found by Mr. de Morgan in a tomb of the Old Empire at Abusir, or the interesting discovery made by Mr. Arthur Evans of seals and other objects from the prehistoric sites of Crete and other parts of the Aegean, inscribed with hieroglyphic characters which reveal a new system of writing that must at one time have existed by the side of the Hittite hieroglyphs, and may have had its origin in the influence exercised by Egypt on the peoples of the Mediterranean in the age of the 12th dynasty. In volumes 4, 5, and 6 we find ourselves in the full light of an advanced culture. The nations of the ancient East are no longer each pursuing an isolated existence, and separately developing the seeds of civilization and culture on the banks of the Euphrates and the Nile. Asia and Africa have met in mortal combat. Babylonia has carried its empire to the frontiers of Egypt, and Egypt itself has been held in bondage by the Hyksos strangers from Asia. In return, Egypt has driven back the wave of invasion to the borders of Mesopotamia, has substituted an empire of its own in Syria for that of the Babylonians, and has forced the Babylonian king to treat with its pharaoh on equal terms. In the track of war and diplomacy have come trade and commerce; Western Asia is covered with roads, along which the merchant and the courier travel incessantly, and the whole civilized world of the Orient is knit together in a common literary culture and common commercial interests. The age of isolation has thus been succeeded by an age of intercourse, partly military and antagonistic, partly literary and peaceful. Professor Maspero paints for us this age of intercourse, describes its rise in character, its decline and fall. For the unity of Eastern civilization was again shattered. The Hittites descended from the ranges of the Taurus upon the Egyptian province of northern Syria, and cut off the Semites of the west from those of the east. The Israelites poured over the Jordan out of Edom and Moab, and took possession of Canaan, while Babylonia itself, for so many centuries the ruling power of the Oriental world, had to make way for its upstart rival, Assyria. The old imperial powers were exhausted and played out, and it needed time before the new forces which were to take their place could acquire sufficient strength for their work. As usual, Professor Maspero has been careful to embody in his history the very latest discoveries and information. Notice, it will be found, has been taken even of the stela of Meneptah, recently disinterred by Professor Petrie, on which the name of the Israelites is engraved. At Elephantine, I found, a short time since, on a granite boulder, an inscription of Khufu Anka, whose sarcophagus of red granite is one of the most beautiful objects in the Gizeh Museum, which carries back the history of the island to the age of the pyramid builders of the fourth dynasty. The boulder was subsequently concealed under the southern side of the city wall, and as fragments of inscribed papyrus coeval with the sixth dynasty have been discovered in the immediate neighbourhood, on one of which mention is made of this domain of Pepi II., it would seem that the town of Elephantine must have been founded between the period of the fourth dynasty and that of the sixth. Manetho is therefore justified in making the fifth and sixth dynasties of Elephantine origin. It is in Babylonia, however, that the most startling discoveries have been made. At Tello, M. de Sarsac has found a library of more than 30,000 tablets, all neatly arranged, piled in order one on the other, and belonging to the age of Judea, B.C. 2700. Many more tablets of an early date have been unearthed at Abu Habba, Sippara, and Jokka, Isin, by Dr. Scheele, working for the Turkish government. But the most important finds have been at Niffer, the ancient Nippur in northern Babylonia, where the American expedition has brought to a close its long work of systematic excavation. Here Mr. Haynes has dug down to the very foundations of the great temple of El Leal, and the chief historical results of his labours have been published by Professor Hilprecht, in the Babylonian Expedition of the University of Pennsylvania, Volume 1, 1896. About midway between the summit and the bottom of the mound, Mr. Hayes laid bare a pavement constructed of huge bricks stamped with the names of Sargon of Akkad and his son Naram Sin. He found also the ancient wall of the city, which had been built by Naram Sin, 13.7 metres wide. The débris of ruined buildings which lies below the pavement of Sargon is as much as 9.25 metres in depth, while that above it, the topmost stratum of which brings us down to the Christian era, is only 11 metres in height. We may form some idea from this of the enormous age to which the history of Babylonian culture and writing reaches back. In fact, Professor Hilprecht quotes with approval Mr. Haynes's words: "We must cease to apply the adjective earliest to the time of Sargon, or to any age or epoch within 1,000 years of his advanced civilization." The golden age of Babylonian history seems to include the reign of Sargon and of Ur-Gur. Many of the inscriptions which belong to this remote age of human culture have been published by Professor Hilprecht. Among them is a long inscription, in 132 lines, engraved on multitudes of large stone vases presented to the temple of El Leal by a certain Lugal Zagizi. Lugal Zagizi was the son of Ukus, the patesi or high priest of the land of the bow, as Mesopotamia, with its Bedouin inhabitants, was called. He not only conquered Babylonia, then known as Kengi, the land of canals and reeds, but founded an empire which extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. This was centuries before Sargon of Akkad followed in his footsteps. Erech became the capital of Lugal Zaggisi's empire, and doubtless received at this time its Sumerian title of "the city" par excellence. For a long while previously there had been war between Babylonia and the land of the bow, whose rulers seem to have established themselves in the city of Kis. At one time we find the Babylonian prince En-sag-sag-ana capturing Kis and its king; at another time it is a king of Kis who makes offerings to the god of Nippur, in gratitude for his victories. To this period belongs the famous Stela of the Vultures, found at Tello, on which is depicted the victory of Dingur-ana-jin, the king of Lagos (Tello), over the Semitic hordes of the land of the bow. It may be noted that the recent discoveries have shown how correct Professor Maspero has been in assigning the kings of Lagos to a period earlier than that of Sargon of Akkad. Professor Hilprecht would place Dingur-ana-jin after the Lugal Zaggisi, and sees in the Stela of the Vultures a monument of the revenge taken by the Sumerian rulers of Lagos for the conquest of the country by the inhabitants of the north. But it is equally possible that it marks the successful reaction of Chaldea against the power established by Lugal Zaggisi. However this may be, the dynasty of Lagos, to which Professor Hilprecht has added a new king, Kagil, reigned in peace for some time, and belonged to the same age as the first dynasty of Ur. This was founded by a certain Lugal Kignub Nidudu, whose inscriptions have been found at Nifur. The dynasty which arose at Ur in later days, circa B.C. 2700, under Gur and Bungi, which has hitherto been known as the first dynasty of Ur, is thus dethroned from its position, and becomes the second. The succeeding dynasty, which also made Ur its capital, and whose kings, Ain Sin, Pur Sin Il, and Gimel Sin, were the immediate predecessors of the first dynasty of Babylon, to which Karn Murabi belonged, must henceforth be termed the third. Among the latest acquisitions from Tello are the seals of the Patizi, Lugal Usumgal, which finally remove all doubts as to the identity of Sargani, king of the city, with the famous Sargon of Akkad. The historical accuracy of Sargon's annals, moreover, have been fully vindicated. Not only have the American excavators found the contemporary monuments of him and his son Naram Sin, but also tablets dated in the years of his campaigns against the land of the Amorites. In short, Sargon of Akkad, so lately spoken of as a half mythical personage, has now emerged into the full glare of authentic history. That the native chronologist had sufficient material for reconstructing the past history of their country is also now clear. The early Babylonian contract tablets are dated by events which officially distinguished the several years of a king's reign, and tablets have been discovered compiled at the close of a reign which gave year by year the events which thus characterized them. One of these tablets, for example, from the excavations at Nifur, begins with the words 1. The year when Parsin II becomes king; 2. The year when Parsin the king conquers Urbilim, and ends with the year when Gimel Sin becomes king of Ur, and conquers the land of Zabsali in the Lebanon. Of special interest to the biblical students are the discoveries made by Mr. Pinches among some of the Babylonian tablets which have recently been acquired by the British Museum. 4 of them relate to no less a personage than Kudur Laghhamar, or Chedor Laomer, king of Elam, as well as to Eri Aku, or Arioch, king of Larsa, and his son Dur-Mak Ilani, to Tughula or Tidal, the son of Gazani, and to their war against Babylon in the time of Kamnurabi. In one of the texts the question is asked, "Who is the son of a king's daughter who has sat on the throne of royalty?" Dur-Mak Ilani, the son of Eri Aku, the son of the lady Kur, has sat on the throne of royalty, from which it may perhaps be inferred that Eri Aku was the son of Kudur Laghhamar's daughter; and in another we read, "Who is Kudur Laghhamar, the doer of mischief? He has gathered together the Umam Manda, has devastated the land of Beel (Babylonia), and has marched at their side." The Umam Manda were the barbarian hordes of the Kurdish mountains, on the northern frontier of Elam, and the name corresponds with that of the Goyim or nations in the 14th chapter of Genesis. We here see Kudur Laghghamar acting as their suzerain lord. Unfortunately all 4 tablets are in a shockingly broken condition, and it is therefore difficult to discover in them a continuous sense or to determine their precise nature. They have, however, been supplemented by further discoveries made by Dr. Scheele at Constantinople. Among the tablets preserved there, he has found letters from Khanmurabi to his vassal Sin Idinam of Larsa, from which we learn that Sin Idinam had been dethroned by the Elamites Kudur Mabag and Ariaku, and had fled for refuge to the court of Khanmurabi at Babylon. In the war which subsequently broke out between Khanmurabi and Kudur Laghghamar, the king of Elam, who it would seem exercised suzerainty over Babylonia for 7 years, Sin Idinam gave material assistance to the Babylonian monarch, and Khanmurabi accordingly bestowed presents upon him as a recompense for his valour on the day of the overthrow of Kudur Laghghamar. I must also refer to a fine scarab, found in the rubbish mounds of the ancient city of Kom in Upper Egypt, which bears upon it the name of Sut-ku Apopi. It shows us that the author of the story of the expulsion of the Hyksos, in calling the king Ra Apopi, merely, like an orthodox Egyptian, substituted the name of the god of Heliopolis for that of the foreign deity. Equally interesting are the scarabs brought to light by Professor Flinders Petrie, on which a hitherto unknown Yaakov Hal, or Jacob El, receives the titles of a pharaoh. In volumes 7, 8, and 9, Professor Maspero concludes his monumental work on the history of the ancient East. The overthrow of the Persian Empire by the Greek soldiers of Alexander marks the beginning of a new era. Europe at last enters upon the stage of history, and becomes heir of the culture and civilization of the Orient. The culture which had grown up and developed on the banks of the Euphrates and Nile passes to the west, and there assumes new features and is inspired with a new spirit. The East perishes of age and decrepitude; its strength is outworn; its power to initiate is past. The long ages through which it had toiled to build up the fabric of civilization are at an end; fresh races are needed to carry on the work which it had achieved. Greece appears upon the scene, and behind Greece looms the colossal figure of the Roman Empire. During the past decade, excavation has gone on apace in Egypt and Babylonia, and discoveries of a startling and unexpected nature have followed in the wake of excavation. Ages that seemed prehistoric step suddenly forth into the day dawn of history; personages whom a sceptical criticism had consigned to the land of myth or fable are clothed once more with flesh and blood, and events which had been long forgotten demand to be recorded and described. In Babylonia, for example, the excavations at Niffer and Tello have shown that Sargon of Akkad, so far from being a creature of romance, was as much a historical monarch as Nebuchadnezzar himself. Monuments of his reign have been discovered, and we learn from them that the empire he is said to have founded had a very real existence. Contracts have been found dated in the years when he was occupied in conquering Syria and Palestine, and a cadastral survey that was made for the purposes of taxation mentions a Canaanite, who had been appointed governor of the land of the Amorites. Even a postal service had already been established along the high roads which knit the several parts of the empire together, and some of the clay seals which franked the letters are now in the museum of the Louvre. At Susa, M. de Morgan, the late director of the Service of Antiquities in Egypt, has been excavating below the remains of the Achremenian period, among the ruins of the ancient Elamite capital. Here he has found numberless historical inscriptions, besides a text in hieroglyphics which may cast light on the origin of the cuneiform characters. But the most interesting of his discoveries are 2 Babylonian monuments that were carried off by Elamite conquerors from the cities of Babylonia. One of them is a long inscription of about 1200 lines belonging to Manistusu, one of the early Babylonian kings, whose name has been met with at Niffer; the other is a monument of Naram Sin, the son of Sargon of Akkad, which it seems was brought as a booty to Susa by Simti Silkat, the grandfather, perhaps, of Ariaku or Arioch. In Armenia also equally important inscriptions have been found by Belk and Lehmann. More than 200 new ones have been added to the list of Vannic texts. It has been discovered from them that the kingdom of Bianius or Van was founded by Ispuinus and Menuas, who rebuilt Yan itself and the other cities which they had previously sacked and destroyed. The older name of the country was Kumussu, and it may be that the language spoken in it was allied to that of the Hittites, since a tablet in hieroglyphics of the Hittite type has been unearthed at Toprak Kalal. One of the newly found inscriptions of Sarduris III shows that the name of the Assyrian god, hitherto read Raman or Riman, was really pronounced Hadad. It describes a war of the Vannic king against Assur Nirari, son of Hadad Nirari, Nirari of Assyria, thus revealing not only the true form of the Assyrian name, but also the parentage of the last king of the older Assyrian dynasty. From another inscription, belonging to Rusas II., the son of Argistus, we learn that campaigns were carried on against Hittites and the Mashi in the later years of Sennacherib's reign, and therefore only just before the irruption of the Cimmerians into the northern regions of Western Asia. The two German explorers have also discovered the site and even the ruins of Muzazir, called Ardennes by the people of Van. They lie on the hill of Shkenna, near Topsana, on the road between Kelishin and Sidek. In the immediate neighbourhood the travellers succeeded in deciphering a monument of Rusas I., partly in Vannic, partly in Assyrian, from which it appears that the Vannic king did not, after all, commit suicide when the news of the fall of Muzazir was brought to him, as is stated by Sargon, but that, on the contrary, he marched against the mountains of Assyria, and restored the fallen city itself. Urzana, the king of Muzazir, had fled to him for shelter, and after the departure of the Assyrian army he was sent back by Rusas to his ancestral domains. The whole of the district in which Muzazir was situated was termed Lulu, and was regarded as the southern province of Ararat. In it was Mount Nazir, on whose summit the ark of the Chaldean Noah rested, and which is therefore rightly described in the book of Genesis as one of the mountains of Ararat. It was probably the Rwandes of today. The discoveries made by Drs. Belk and Lehmann, however, have not been confined to Vannic texts. At the sources of the Tigris Dr. Lehmann has found two Assyrian inscriptions of the Assyrian king, Shalmaneser II., one dated in his 15th and the other in his 31st year, and relating to his campaigns against Aram of Ararat. He has further found that the two inscriptions previously known to exist at the same spot, and believed to belong to Tiglath-Ninip and Assur-Nazir-Pal, are really those of Shalmaneser II., and refer to the war of his 7th year. But it is from Egypt that the most revolutionary revelations have come. At Abydos and Qam el-Ahmar, opposite El Kab, monuments have been disinterred of the kings of the 1st and 2nd dynasties, if not of even earlier princes, while at Nagada, north of Thebes, M. de Morgan has found a tomb which seems to have been that of Menes himself. A new world of art has been opened out before us. Even the hieroglyphic system of writing is as yet immature and strange. But the art is already advanced in many respects. Hard stone was cut into vases and bowls, and even into statuary of considerable artistic excellence. Glazed porcelain was already made, and bronze, or rather copper, was fashioned into weapons and tools. The writing material, as in Babylonia, was often clay, over which seal cylinders of a Babylonian pattern were rolled. Equally Babylonian are the strange and composite animals engraved on some of the objects of this early age, as well as the structure of the tombs, which were built not of stone, but of crude brick, with their external walls panelled and pilastered. Professor Hommel's theory, which brings Egyptian civilization from Babylonia along with the ancestors of the historical Egyptians, has thus been largely verified. But the historical Egyptians were not the first inhabitants of the valley of the Nile. Not only have Paleolithic implements been found on the plateau of the desert, the relics of Neolithic man have turned up in extraordinary abundance. When the historical Egyptians arrived with their copper weapons and their system of writing, the land was already occupied by a pastoral people, who had attained a high level of Neolithic culture. Their implements of flint are the most beautiful and delicately finished that have ever been discovered. they were able to carve vases of great artistic excellence out of the hardest of stone, and their pottery was of no mean quality. Long after the country had come into the possession of the historical dynasties, and had even been united into a single monarchy, their settlements continued to exist on the outskirts of the desert, and the Neolithic culture that distinguished them passed only gradually away. By degrees, however, they intermingled with their conquerors from Asia, and thus formed the Egyptian race of a later day. But they had already made Egypt what it has been throughout the historical period. Under the direction of the Asiatic immigrants and of the engineering science whose first home had been in the alluvial plain of Babylonia, they accomplished those great works of irrigation which confined the Nile to its present channel, which cleared away the jungle and the swamp that had formerly bordered the desert, and turned them into fertile fields. Theirs were the hands which carried out the plans of their more intelligent masters, and cultivated the valley when once it had been reclaimed. The Egypt of history was the creation of a twofold race: the Egyptians of the monuments supplied the controlling and directing power; the Egyptians of the Neolithic graves bestowed upon it their labour and their skill. The period treated of by Professor Maspero in these volumes is one for which there is an abundance of materials such as do not exist for the earlier portions of his history. The evidence of the monuments is supplanted by that of the Hebrew and classical writers. But on this very account it is in some respects more difficult to deal with, and the conclusions arrived at by the historian are more open to question and dispute. In some cases conflicting accounts are given of an event, which seem to rest on equally good authority; in other cases, there is sudden failure of materials just where the thread of the story becomes most complicated. Of this the decline and fall of the Assyrian Empire is a prominent example. For our knowledge of it, we have still to depend chiefly on the untrustworthy legends of the Greeks. Our views must be coloured more or less by our estimate of Herodotus. Those who, like myself, place little or no confidence in what he tells us about Oriental affairs will naturally form a very different idea of the death struggle of Assyria from that formed by writers who still see in him the father of Oriental history. Even where the native monuments have come to our aid, they have not unfrequently introduced difficulties and doubts where none seemed to exist before, and have made the task of the critical historian harder than ever. Cyrus and his forefathers, for instance, turn out to have been kings of Anzan, and not of Persia, thus explaining why it is that the Neo-Susian language appears by the side of the Persian and the Babylonian as one of the three official languages of the Persian Empire; but we still have to learn what was the relation of Anzan to Persia on one hand, and to Susa on the other, and when it was that Cyrus of Anzan became also king of Persia. In the annalistic tablet he is called king of Persia for the first time in the 9th year of Nabonidos. Similar questions arise as to the position and nationality of Astyages. He is called in the inscriptions not a Mede but a Manda, a name which, as I showed many years ago, meant for the Babylonian a barbarian of Kurdistan. I have myself little doubt that the Manda over whom Astyages ruled were the Scythians of classical tradition, who, as may be gathered from a text published by Mr. Strong, had occupied the ancient kingdom of Elypi. It is even possible that in the Madiyas of Herodotus we have a reminiscence of the Manda of cuneiform inscriptions. That the Greek writers should have confounded the Mada or Medes with the Manda or barbarians is not surprising. We find even Berossos describing one of the early dynasties of Babylonia as Median, where Manda, and not Mada, must plainly be meant. These and similar problems, however, will doubtless be cleared up by the progress of excavation and research. Perhaps M. de Morgan's excavations at Susa may throw some light on them, but it is to the work of the German expedition, which has recently begun the systematic exploration of the site of Babylon, that we must chiefly look for help. The Babylon of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar rose on the ruins of Nineveh, and the story of downfall of the Assyrian Empire must still be lying buried under its mounds. A. H. Sayce. Translator's Preface. In completing the translation of this great work, I have to thank Professor Maspero for kindly permitting me to appeal to him on various questions which arose while preparing the translation. His patience and courtesy have alike been unfailing in every matter submitted for his decision. I am indebted to Miss Bradbury for kindly supplying, in the midst of much other literary work for the Egypt Exploration Fund, the translation of the chapter on the gods, and also of the earlier parts of some of the first chapters. She has, moreover, helped me in my own share of the work, with many suggestions and hints, which her intimate connection with the late Miss Amelia B. Edwards fully qualified her to give. As in their original there is a lack of uniformity in the transcription and accentuation of Arabic names, I have ventured to alter them in several cases to the form most familiar to English readers. The spelling of the ancient Egyptian words has, at Professor Maspero's request, been retained throughout, with the exception that the French u has been invariably represented by u, for example, Khnummu by Khnummu. By an act of international courtesy, the director of the Imprimerie Nationale has allowed the beautifully cut hieroglyphic and cuneiform type, used in the original, to be employed in the English edition, and I take advantage of this opportunity to express to him our thanks, and the appreciation of his graceful act. M. L. McClure. End of Introduction. Read by Professor Heather Mbai. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.